Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Kate Younger. I'm the research director of the project Ukrainian European Dialogue at the Institute for Human Sciences. Our project is dedicated to the proposition that Ukrainians and the rest of Europe have much to learn from each other, that it needs to be a process of mutual exchange. So in that regard, we bring fellows to the Institute here in Vienna. We organize events, have publications. And so it's in the framework of that I actually got to know Andrei to begin with, who was our fellow back in 2017. And so it's a real pleasure to welcome Andrei Kurkov back to Vienna.
Thank you.
Yes.
Good afternoon.
Andrei Kurkov barely needs any introduction here in Vienna, as he is extremely well known across the German-speaking world and indeed the world as a whole. He's the author of nearly 24 novels, as well as children's books, television and movie scripts, radio dramas all over the place. His works have been translated into 37 languages. He's a frequent commentator on current events in the Ukrainian and international media, and he is president of PEN Ukraine. It's such a pleasure to have you here with us today for our conversation, so thank you. So just to give a little bit of background as to where this conversation, the idea for this conversation came from, as the theme was being settled for this year's Vienna Humanities Festival, Hope and Despair, it happened to be right around the time of the Ukrainian presidential elections, which elicited plenty of feelings of both hope and despair in the Ukrainian electorate and more broadly. In a way, this is something that I'd love to hear your thoughts on. There are some ways in which it feels to me like the election, in which, as we know, the comedian and non-politician Volodymyr Zelensky ended up winning 73% of the vote over the incumbent Petro Poroshenko. In some ways, this election to me felt in some ways like a referendum on hope and despair in Ukraine, right? So there's the hope of the post-Maidan era. Has something really changed since 2014, and does Poroshenko need another 5 years to keep working on what's developed? Or, on the other hand, has a sense of despair set in as the war continues on in eastern Ukraine, as things don't feel like they're changing fast enough, and we need to bring in new blood to sort of get a fresh start. What do you think, with now the perspective of a few months, I know a few months have passed since then, did you get a sense that there was this dichotomy going on in public discourse, among your friends, you personally, between hope and despair?
Well, it's a very broad question.
I know.
I don't know what to start with, but maybe there are several aspects we should mention before trying to paint a social picture of Ukraine. What we had in 2019 during the election. One can say it was a takeover by one TV channel of a whole country, because the comedy show team became from virtual real and won the election, or the representative, the producer won the election and then brought the team to govern the country. Is it comparable to govern the TV channel or one program or the country? Of course, it's not comparable. But the fact that 73% of the voters gave their votes to this team, I mean, it does say that they felt despair, thinking that Poroshenko will continue, or they gave lots of hope, thinking that somebody who doesn't know anything about corruption, let's presume, will change the country using the people who are completely new and never were engaged in political or other activities. So at the same time, 25% of Ukrainian voters, I mean, they showed despair with the result of the elections, and they even, instead of a frame, sort of dark frame or what do you call it, obituary frame on Facebook, they united their avatars with like 25% picture. Yeah. And then now people say that actually now it's not 25, it's like 15, and it's diminishing. And does it mean that the people who actually were pessimistic are becoming optimistic or realistic or not? But obviously the situation is changing. And we have now several months Mr. Zelensky in power, and people who actually were very pessimistic, I think they expected situation to be much worse. People who were very optimistic, they expected the situation would be much, much better. But still he has incredible 80% of support, if we believe statistics, which makes him comparable to Putin, who has also, or used to have 80% of support. But obviously, I think this kind of sort of feeling of the situation in Ukraine doesn't give you grounds now, neither for much hope nor for great despair, because everybody is looking and waiting something should happen. Well, something happened a couple of days ago, but it is not what we expected to happen. But generally, I think we are now in the transitional period from the old elite to the new elite via no elite. So I think what we have now, actually, no elite is trying to govern the country.
So you would characterize Zelensky and his team as a non-elite?
For the moment, yeah.
So going back to thinking about the hope that you can find in a situation like this, one thing that a lot of people have written about Zelensky is that he inspired so much hope because he was this empty vessel onto which everyone could push their own expectations, that they could sort of push their own vision for what the future would be because he so actively avoided taking any real positions on anything. Do you think that that's a fair characterization of what he's done?
It is more or less fair, yeah. I mean, he is famous for being funny about the politicians of the previous generation. His humor was very nasty, sometimes very politically incorrect, like he was speaking on the physiological problems of some deputies and some politicians. But I mean, he made people laugh. And people are used to think that actually if somebody makes you laugh, it means that he has a lot of energy and he is sharing his energy through laughter. But I mean, you cannot actually rule the country with laughter. And now when he changed role, I mean, he is supposed to be very serious now, even sadly serious. But I mean, in order to be accepted as some serious politician, you have to show some experience, to show some deeds, some achievements, etc. And I'm sure he is permanently looking for achievements he can achieve very quickly, which is not very easy in Ukrainian politics and at all in politics. Yeah. So I remember him being compared really during the elections to an empty bottle which can be filled with good wine or bad wine or milk or yogurt or something else. But I mean, the question is who will fill this bottle and with what? And it's a very strange cocktail now. And nobody is sure who filled the bottle. Because I mean, some of the, we used to think that actually the leader is seen through his entourage, through his political party, allies, etc. The political party, which is called servant to the people, was virtual and politically remains virtual, although it has faces and it has majority of seats in the parliament, but it includes people with almost opposite views, with contradicting statements, etc. And there are some already conflicts which were unavoidable in any way. So if they represent the president, then it's difficult to say what he thinks, because I mean, sometimes one of his aides says that, oh no, this was private opinion, this was personal opinion, but I haven't heard them saying, this is our opinion.
Mm-hmm. Which is in direct contrast to some of the, and this kind of is slightly off track, but it's in direct contrast to another Ukrainian political phenomenon of the parliamentary elections in particular, which is the emergence of Holos, Slava Vakarchuk's party, which actually had a platform in a certain way, right? So, or maybe that's false, I don't know.
Well, I mean, Slava Vakarchuk's ideas and I would say party was not virtual from the very beginning. And maybe because of this, it could look boring to the young voters. Actually, I think, this non-existent party which became the majority, it was, not only fun to vote for this party, but it was a very brave experiment. And at the same time, voters don't take responsibility personally. They don't answer for their actions.
Right. They took this experiment, but they don't have to necessarily bear the responsibility for its outcomes.
Yeah. So we are all watching what is happening. I want everything to be good. I'm pathologically optimistic, but I'm very cautious about today's situation, and I understand that somebody can learn very quickly how to be a politician, but how to be a president without being a politician before. It's a very brave experiment, and if Ukraine succeeds,
more power
it
to
will
you.
be probably the first case in the history, and Ukrainians want to be the first everywhere, which is natural, because it's a nation which survived lots of dramas and lots of problems, and actually used to find itself in difficult situations.
Well, this brings me to a to shift focus slightly. You say Ukraine wants to be first. This is one thing that people have been, that Ukraine has seemed quite extraordinary, at least in Western media coverage, for the fact that they elected this inexperienced comedian as president. But I wonder if that's accurate, right? If it really is a new phenomenon to have a comedian in politics, to have this be the first.
It's not the first comedian. You don't need to be a professional comedian to become Boris Johnson, for example. You need to start from journalism.
Well, but there's a distinction between this in a certain way, right? So Zelensky is a comedian who goes into politics, whereas Johnson is sort of a clown in politics, right? Yeah. So is there a special role for someone with a comedic background coming into politics? You see plenty of there are other cases of this, right? So you get Beppe Grillo, or you get Die Partei in Germany, or whatever. But is Zelensky in the Ukrainian context somehow different, or a part of this broader European phenomenon?
Well, both. Ukrainian context is very different, of course. And it's true that actually the old elite was post-Soviet elite, and people got tired of them, and actually they were a separate entity always. From Kuchma's time onwards, and at some point, if every new government, every new president would forget to communicate his plans and ideas to the voters. So it would be some kind of a remote factory of laws and decisions in the forest, and then people were surviving without being in touch with the governing body. And in contrast to this situation, Zelensky from the TV was very easily accessible. He was, of course, he was for 4 or 5 years on TV screen as President Goloborodko. So, and you know that, we love celebrities, especially TV celebrities. And, I can understand that people subconsciously felt that actually somebody who managed to stay as the president in sitcom for 5 years definitely can do 5 years offline.
This is interesting. So do you think that his image as president on Servant of the People dominates more in people's image of him than him as a comedian? Or because the sense I have of that show is it's quite earnest, right, in a certain way?
I think actually, the image of the president is much stronger than anything else, because he did a lot of sketches, but he has a very specific voice, easy to recognize in the darkness. And he was this television or televised president. So I think this is the main image of him in the heads of people who watch TV. And I think some of them are now disappointed because he he stopped making them laugh.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's a person with the same voice, same face, same manners, but no bicycle, because in the film he was traveling to his office by bicycle, and no fun, no humor.
Real life got in the way.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's how Zelensky fits into the Ukrainian political scene, but I wonder about this sort of how he fits into this broader, maybe European trend towards comedy in politics. And the reason that I'm saying this is because I think that there's always been a relationship between humor and politics, obviously. But it seems like for a long time it has been humor's role is to critique power, whereas now there's this sort of infusion of humor and comedy into power. So you see that with Zelensky's election, you see that with a clown like Boris Johnson occupying the prime minister's seat. Do you think that's something that's changing?
The general world tendency is that actually politics approaching show business, and it is part of show business in America, maybe less in England, but still funny, more in Italy. So I mean, it is a world tendency. But of course, I mean, if you think that somebody who is a comedian becoming a president in the country which is at war,
yes,
making lots of promises also on the billboards and verbally, and then after the victory starting explaining, sometimes himself, sometimes through his aides, that these promises are unrealistic. And people actually don't complain, which means that they knew that the promises were unrealistic, or at least half of them knew. And they still expect actually him to become a productive and positive president. But at the same time, I mean, being a president of Ukraine in the times of Putin and Trump, which have very specific senses of humor. So I mean, I think maybe he was trying to make Trump laugh, because I mean, you can win victory. I mean, sort of friendship and a nice relationship with the humor, which is normal situation at the table. Yeah. But generally, I mean.
Well, I wonder if there's a certain way in which, so one of the most notable things I think from Zelensky's first months was even before his inauguration when he posted on Facebook, so the Russian government said, oh, we're willing to start handing out more passports, right, to Ukrainian citizens. And Zelensky posts back this really almost this message that had almost a trolling tone to it of saying, sure, go ahead. We don't care because our people know they'll look at you and they see what sort of future awaits them with a Russian passport. And I wondered, and this was like one of the first times where he really impressed me. And it almost felt like he was able, with this sort of entertainer or comedian's way of seeing things, of spinning things, to get at this very serious issue from a humorous angle. I wonder if you think that that's a fair characterization.
Well, now actually the members of his political party are talking about double citizenship as reality, as long-awaited reality. From my personal point of view, it is a very dangerous idea. In both understanding in Zelensky's words, I mean this invitation for Russians to come and to become Ukrainians. At the same time keeping Russian passports and being able to vote in Ukraine. And the people actually who are talking about this now, I mean, they are very serious.
So he makes this statement that seems in jest.
The first reaction, I mean, when he was trolling, it was trolling, yeah. I'm sure it was trolling, yeah. But there was a discussion in the country already for years and years about double citizenship because I think in the last parliament probably some 20% of the members of parliament were owners of other passports. And very famous Ukrainian Prime Minister Lazarenko, ex-boss of Yulia Tymoshenko, he was arrested in somewhere in America when he was traveling on Panamanian passports. So I mean, the passports, I mean, rich Ukrainians are collectors of passports. So I mean, they can advocate this idea. But I mean, but for ordinary people, it's a question much more serious. Yeah. And talking about trolling and sense of humor of Zelensky, I mean, the first joke, I mean, I'm not TV viewer, but there is a traditional moment almost in every Ukrainian family when everybody watches TV. It's 5 minutes to midnight on 31st of December, when every president wishes Ukrainian people lots of luck and explaining how happy they should be, etc. And so 2 minutes before Poroshenko's speech, on the same channel where he played President Goloborodko, Zelensky greeted Ukrainian people as Ukrainian president half a year before the elections. And it was trolling of Poroshenko. It was obviously an attack by Kolomoisky, because oligarch Kolomoisky is the owner of the TV channel. And for me, that was actually the moment when obviously Zelensky decided to go into politics, or he knew that he will become the president. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this was real trolling.
Right.
Yeah.
So there are ways in which it can function as a precursor to, so this trolling in a certain way functions as a precursor to then something real. You know what I mean? Because in both of these cases, there's this, he makes these public statements that are presented as jokes or trolling, and then.
But I mean, he loves YouTube monologues, and he did a lot of YouTube monologues before the elections, addressing Poroshenko, like giving him 24 hours to answer the questions, or to come or not to come to the stadium, etc. And now this time is gone. He is the president, and he doesn't send this kind of monologues neither to Putin, nor to Lukashenko, nor to Trump. So it's different life now. So I mean, his set of mind and manners changed now. He is not using the weapon he likes and he used to, but I don't know whether he has teachers who can teach him new methods of achieving the goals.
Yeah, well, we'll see now, because he finds himself in a very tricky international position, does he not? So I wonder if we could leave that aside and shift slightly. So we've been talking about the role of humor in politics, but I also wonder about the role of humor in maintaining a sense of hope in society, right? So I think this is something that you are a master of, in fact, is writing in a darkly humorous way, while being, as you describe yourself, a perpetual optimist. So how do those two go together? Is the way that you think about the world, how does that reflect itself in the humor that you write with?
Well, I mean, in general, I use humor instead of reminding the readers that there will be happy end. If not in this novel, then in the next one. Because actually, I mean, even if you describe very dramatic situations, if you describe it with irony, self-irony, or sad humor, or black humor, it gives you hope. It gives readers hope. So I mean, it makes like a filter that doesn't let anger or despair get through to the readers.
Yeah, and that's really valuable, because that, in my mind, that also prevents, like, despair leads to a sense of inaction. It can lead to a sense of inaction, right? Whereas if you still have some hope, there's the sense that you can make a positive change.
Yeah, I mean, many years ago, in 92 or 93, I sort of developed a small short theory for myself about use of optimism, because at that time lots of friends of mine were living for abroad. We had an economical crisis. Crime was incredible. I mean, it was dangerous on the streets in the evening. And one of my friends who was living actually for Israel asked me, are you still a stupid optimist, or you are a normal pessimist like everybody else now? And I said, no, I'm still an optimist, but now I'm black optimist. And he asked, and what does it mean to be black optimist? I said, it means that actually you know that everything will end well, but you are not sure you will be alive then. I mean, today I am a normal gray optimist. Yes, I even published novel Grey
Yes,
Bees
I was about to.
in German.
I was about to ask exactly about this because your novel that most recently came out in German translation, Grey Bees, you yourself said that the optimism is fading in this a little bit, or the humor is fading at least.
Because it's novel about life in the gray zone in Donbass, about two men stuck in one village abandoned by everybody else between positions of separatists and pro-Russian and Russian forces and Ukrainian army, and then it continues to annex Crimea. So I mean, it's not about battle or fighting or sort of lots of killed and wounded people, but it's about the atmosphere in which everything which was gray before becomes even more gray, especially inside the mind of people.
And there's this sense that things won't change one way or the other, right? Or
well, I mean, my main character, he is early retired inspector of safety in the mines. So I mean, he is a simple man who learns from nature more than from the universities. He never went to any university. So for this kind of people, and I traveled 3 times to the war zone, I mean, they accept what is happening as a new reality, and they try to adapt their life. But of course, I mean, it has an influence, impact on them. So, and I remember in 2015 when I was traveling along the front line on the Ukrainian side towards Severodonetsk, people, locals didn't want to talk to strangers. So only children would talk to me. And the adults, they see a stranger, and they wouldn't answer my questions. They would just turn away. I mean, it's different now. They talk. Okay. They talk. Definitely lots of things they understand, and they have different judgment now about the situation than before. But those who decided to stay, they accepted the reality.
But in a very different community because so many people have left, right? I mean, is this, have
well,
you...
probably more than 2 million left,
Yeah,
2.5 million, 1.5 are resettlers in Ukraine or refugees, and 800,000, I think, went to Russia. But some of them from both sides came back because they couldn't find either cheap flat to rent or jobs or something, or just...
Well, this, speaking of Grey Bees, and then your previous work, Schengen History, in German, I don't know the title.
Kartographie der Freiheit.
Yes. So these 2 novels are very interesting to me because they take up very, very relevant themes that are dominating political discourse, right? So the question of the gray zones and what is going to happen in the Donbass, but also the question of migration within the European Union and belonging within the European Union. And do you see this as an evolution? Because your earlier novels definitely reflected post-Soviet realities, but they may not have like dove headfirst into these hot issues. So is this, what is driving you in this direction?
Well, I mean, I didn't want to write Grey Bees, frankly speaking. I wanted to write Schengen story, but also, I mean, the reason was quite surreal. Because I know Lithuania very well, and I have many friends who are writers there, and they were complaining to me several times that nobody wrote a big Lithuanian novel yet. So I decided to write one.
There you go.
And they hoped that I would write about 13th century Gediminas and all these nobles and great Lithuanian kingdom. But I mean, for me, the topic of migration was much more important because Lithuania, a small country which in 1991 had 3 million population, lost 30% of population practically, most of them young people. And they went to the Western Europe. I mean, they were already part of European Union and part of Schengen zone when they left. So for me, and I am traveling a lot, I'm traveling 6 months every year already for the last 20 years, mostly in Europe, and I was following lots of stories of migrants, especially in England, because of the family connection. My wife is British, and I love Kent, for example. It's a beautiful county facing not Brussels, Belgium. and this county was turned into some kind of social dump for not only for migrants, because I mean they came there because it was the cheapest place, but also for the homeless and unemployed people from other counties, because it was for the state it was cheaper to finance their life in this county. And I remember when I was like 15 years ago in Margate, and suddenly I saw some kind of an announcement in many languages, and I understood that I can read all these languages: Serb, Romanian, Polish, Russian, and it was explanation where to take empty bottles on the street. Then I went to English pub, and I thought that I will talk to barman, and he will be definitely a Brit or Irish, and it was Bosnian. And it was interesting. Yeah. And actually, I mean, this couple of Bosnians, I mean, they turned English pub into Balkan pub, and they were secretly serving their slivovitz very cheaply, £1 for a shot. And so, I mean, all this migrations experiences, they accumulated, and they were looking for exit from my head.
And so they found
That's
it in
why
Lithuania.
the book is so thick. But the Grey Beast, actually, I didn't plan to write. I mean, I published a Ukrainian diary about Maidan, annexation of Crimea at that time, and it is a real diary that I kept every day during the events from 23rd of November 2013 till 23rd of April 2014. But then actually we had a huge influx of people from Bosnia, from Donbass. It's interesting. Yeah, Freudian slip, from Donbass and Kiev. And I mean, suddenly on the street you see that every third car, every fourth car has Donbass number plate. And then among my friends, suddenly there are lots of new friends from Donetsk and from Lugansk and from this area. And I talked to them, and one of them, and actually those who were successful, they bought houses or flats in Kiev before the events as investment. And they dreamt always that if they become big business people, they will move to Kiev. But they were forced to move to Kiev earlier. And one of them told me that actually he is going every month by car to a small village, practically on the edge of the gray zone, where only 7 families left. And he's taking them food and medicine and some money, although they don't need money because there is no shop there. There are no shops. And they are making, I mean, they have allotments, sort of a couple of fields, and they grow tomatoes and cucumbers, etc. And they pickle them, and he is buying these pickles from them, and they are sold in Kiev through another cafe owned by somebody else from Donbass region. So I mean, I started thinking about gray zone, and I travel also in Ukraine. And actually, when I was traveling, especially along the borders, I had sometimes very strange feeling that this is not exactly Ukraine. It's something else plus Ukraine, or Ukraine plus something else. And then I thought that actually the gray zone begins, it's not a geographical notion. It begins in the head. It's actually when there is no connection between person and the country, or the state. Mm-hmm. So I mean, he or she is connected to the house, to the street, to the village, to the region, but I mean there is no sort of affinity between the state and the person. And then actually the person loses interest or doesn't have interest to find out what is happening in the country, what kind of changes are coming, what kind of new laws are accepted, what are politicians doing, are they stealing money from the budget or not? Because I mean, you are self-centered or you are community-centered. And then another thing, actually, after my trips to Donbass before Maidan, I had a very strange also feeling, because I understood that for the ideal state to function, you need 5 spaces that coincide. Okay. Yeah, like geopolitical space at the border of the country. Mm-hmm. And then inside this border you have legal space, which means that the same Ukrainian laws are functioning on Ukrainian territory. financial space, the same currency, and then cultural space and information space. Cultural space, which means that actually the same films or books are read or films are watched in Donbass, in Odessa, in Transcarpathian, and then actually after the premiere people are talking about the films everywhere because this is the cultural context. The best phrases from the books and from the films enter the conversations, they remain in the language, etc., become phraseologism. The same about songs, etc. But Donbass and Crimea were never covered by Ukrainian cultural space. They were part of Russian cultural space. And the same goes about information. So, I mean, they were never checking Ukrainian sources of information. They were watching Russian news about Ukraine. And my sort of strongest experience in this sense was that when I asked a person, I think Starobelsk or somewhere else, whether he goes abroad or not, a man of 50, he said, no, I never go abroad. Sometimes go to Moscow, to Rostov, but I never go abroad. So, I mean, this eastern border didn't exist in his head, and I think it was quite a typical answer. Because for these people, actually, if Russian culture and Russian information are not foreign, then Russia also is not foreign country for them.
And so then you understand the challenges that face the Ukrainian state, right? Yeah, absolutely.
But to smaller percentage, I mean, the similar situation existed in Transcarpathian region on the border with Slovakia and Hungary, and in Bessarabia. I mean, there is no separatism there, but there are areas where you don't have Ukrainian culture and Ukrainian information.
Sure. But then there's the difference there between who the bordering country is, right? That's one of the key differences there. Well, I wonder, we'll open up to questions soon, but I wondered if we could talk about one other thing, and if it's the ways that in which it might be bringing you hope, which is to say, how do you see the Ukrainian literary scene developing since the Maidan? I know you were telling me this morning about a young writer from Donetsk who you're bringing here to Vienna as part of the Buchmesse.
It's not me, it's publisher.
Well, sorry, yes.
But yes. I will be happy to present him,
Yes.
But, well, I mean, somehow any conflict like this, any war, provokes a new wave of literary things, I mean, literary texts or docudramas or films. And for the last 10 years, I think the Ukrainian literature became much more masculine. Because, I mean, in Ukraine, in the old times, poetry was more important than prose. And the famous tendency in Ukrainian cinema from Dovzhenko's time was called Ukrainian poetical cinema. So the images were more important than political messages or something else. And now we have prose and poetry which are very politicized, which are very militant. And we have lots of people who think that they should write something which is important for the society. It doesn't mean that society reads it, of course, But I mean, suffice it to say that we have now approximately 300 books published about the war in Donbass. Most of them are written by the volunteers or soldiers. There were some writers, young writers, who actually took part or were subscribed or
enrolled.
So we have now the war literature, which we didn't have, because I mean the Ukrainian literature about Second World War is not considered Ukrainian anymore. It is Soviet literature, and now Ukraine had and has its own war, which will remain in the literature. It exists already in the films. There are at least 2 big films made about the events in Donbass. And the only topic which is not present yet really is Crimea.
Yes, in some ways that's harder.
Yeah, it's harder to work on, and I mean I had to do research on the situation now through my friends Crimean Tatars for the Grey Bees novel, and it was not easy.
Yes.
Because people who are in the Crimea, they are afraid to answer questions by email or by messengers. They're sure that they are checked. And those actually Crimean Tatars who are, or 15,000 left Crimea and moved to continental Ukraine, most of them cannot come back.
Yes.
So they don't have the up-to-date information.
Yeah. That makes it much harder. Yeah, I completely
But
understand.
but we have also writers who are Donbass refugees, and the most well-known ones are Volodymyr Zelensky from Donetsk, who started writing in Ukrainian. Now he wrote a novel in Ukrainian language after receiving 2 big Russian literary prizes before the events, because actually he was not published in Ukraine before Maidan, but he says now that even if Donetsk comes back to Ukraine, will part of Ukraine, he will not go back there. He will not be able to live with these people, next to these people. And another interesting writer who writes in Ukrainian, Alexei Chupa, his book will be published next month by Haimon Verlag in Innsbruck, and he moved to Lviv, and he will come for the book Wien. So I invite you to check the program and to come for the launch of his book, because he's very interesting guy. I mean, it's true to say that actually Donbass people had, especially intellectual, they had different mentality, and I think they needed much more courage to be intellectual in the society where hierarchy was like in the prison or in the army, and the cult of physical force was much higher than the cult of moral authority.
So to become a writer in that environment is much.
It was not easy.
Yeah, I can imagine. Well, we'll open up to questions from the audience now. So if anyone has anything for Andrei, please.
Hi. First, I just want to say, Mr. Kurkov, you've been an inspiration as a writer to me for a long time, since the 90s when I was living in Lviv. Sorry. I've also been working in Poland for a long time, and one thing you see in Poland lately is just the millions of Ukrainians who come and work there. And I was wondering if that is having any impact back in Ukraine on popular culture, on attitudes, just the cross connections now between Poland and Ukraine, which seem to really be building up, or if there's also a literature of exile developing in Ukraine, or in Ukrainian, as you have all these Ukrainians living abroad.
Sorry, didn't get it. Yeah. Well, you know what happened to Poland? That 1 million Poles went to Britain and became the best plumbers. I don't know what happened to British plumbers, but the best Ukrainian plumbers went to Poland, and now we have 1,200,000 Ukrainian workers in Poland, and about 100,000 students. Because I mean, for Ukrainians, it's very easy to learn Polish, and the two nations actually are related culturally also. What is interesting that we didn't have 1 million of somebody coming to Ukraine, so we still have perspective, and I hope they will not come from the east. But I'm not sure, because I mean all the movement of people like this, working migration is coming usually from in our area from the east towards the west. I think Ukrainians who are in Poland are not influenced in Polish culture, because Polish culture is and literature is very self-sufficient. It's very rich. At the same time, I think Polish literature does have an impact on Ukraine, on Ukrainian intellectual life. Yeah, but I mean, we have during the last 3 or 4 years, we have also political problems with Poland, and actually, it looks like mentioned President Zelensky is trying to solve the problems between Ukraine and Poland and Ukraine and Hungary. But I mean, you put some other question in the end, or which I missed, or if you can keep the microphone a bit further away from the.
Yes, sorry. It was a question whether there's any literature of exile. The Soviet Union had a great literature of exile with people like Gazdanov and Nabokov, obviously, back in the 30s, and then Limonov and Dovlatov. Is there any Ukrainians abroad who are writing interesting things?
Well, Ukrainian writers abroad, it is quite an interesting phenomenon, actually. Tanya Malarchuk, for example, lives in Vienna, and I think she started writing in German, but she has her readers, a lot of her readers in Ukraine. We have a cult lady writer for the students, Irena Karpa, who lives in Paris. He worked as a diplomat there, and now she remained there after finishing her diplomatic career. But it's not a mass phenomenon. So, I mean, I can name you several more, but everyone is a separate entity. It's not like we have diaspora literature written by Ukrainians in America and Canada in the last 100 years. And this is a huge thing. And there are scientists who are studying it. It's sometimes interesting, but it's more important from the historical point of view to learn the history of diaspora. Yeah. But otherwise, we don't have clusters of Ukrainian writers outside of Ukraine.
In fact, one interesting phenomenon actually is going the other way. I've heard you talk a little bit before about Russian writers who move to Ukraine as a sort of exiled writing community in a way. Is that a phenomenon, you think?
Well, we have a number of journalists and poets and writers from Russia who moved to Ukraine because they thought that Ukraine is a more democratic type of another Russia. And it makes actually Ukrainian intellectuals very angry because they don't want Ukraine to be democratic Russia. They want Ukraine to be democratic Ukraine. But some of these writers, I mean, they even started learning Ukrainian in order to speak it, not to write in Ukrainian. And I cannot say that they are popular or they are well read in Ukraine. They just represent something more political than artistic by their presence, yeah. And this is probably also connected with the trolling, Zelensky's trolling Putin, that you can send us more of this. But again, I mean, it's a very dangerous invitation because, I mean, you never know. Russian Secret Service is very talented and inherited all the methods of ex-KGB, and we can get a couple of detachments of democratic writers who will be colonels or majors in reality.
Thank you. My question is going towards the tagline, humor in politics. Imagine your country is in a very, very bad situation, and you have two presidential candidates. Both of them have quite good ideas. Their policies are very, very good, you think, or quite good, and they are quite similar. But one candidate is really, really hilarious. So he has a lot of humor. His press conferences are practically comedy shows. He cracks jokes one after the other. So he's a really, really funny person, or she, by the way. So the candidate is really, really funny. The other candidate is not funny at all. This person is very, very serious, does not know jokes at all. So my question is, which candidate would you choose and why?
Well, I will look for the third one, of course. I think, I mean, I am afraid of depressed politicians, and hilarious politicians actually usually mean that they are happy, which means that they don't want to become sad, caring about the problems in the country. I think, I mean, if you have said somebody who is very funny and very clever, maybe I would go for such a person with a very clever humor, because I mean, humor has lots of different levels, and usually people who are hilarious or taken as hilarious by everybody else, they represent the lower levels of humor.
I want to talk about the role of despair in politics, maybe a little bit more. We can watch that many politicals, they use the despair to make politics. They tell stories about catastrophic things. They tell most of them lies. You see it in America, you see it in Hungary, you see it in Turkey, and you see it in England. And then they make the people fear. They give them fear, and when people believe in them, then they give them hope. First, they make them despair. And then they give them hope. If you vote me, my party, and so then it will be better. And I'm the only way. So this is the way how people vote them. And this is a very usual way to make politics. And my question is, why is this trick, a very simple trick, working?
Well, it works because of the very low level of general education everywhere, I think. And if you see the intellectual level of many new politicians in Europe, in Italy or in Greece, and compare them with the educational level of politicians of 1930s or 40s or 50s, 60s, probably, maybe it's my sort of wrong perception of education, level of education of the older politicians, but I have a feeling sometimes meeting with politicians that they lack something, like education. But generally, I mean, people, it's very easy to divide people by fear. And the war in Donbass that we have is the result of this, also of this division of people performed by the politicians who wanted not to propose ideas, but to control their potential voters on the regional level. So, I mean, like Western Ukrainians were always said by their politicians that you should be afraid of Donbass because the bandits will come and take over your businesses. And then the people in Donbass, they were told by their politicians that the Ukrainian nationalists from the West will come and will force you to speak Ukrainian and will throw you out to Russia, etc. And I believed it wouldn't work because, I mean, I've been following these political games for 20 years. And, I mean, after 20 years it worked. I mean, it created this border, which one can say is the border between two mentalities, collective Soviet mentality or post-Soviet and individualistic Ukrainian. But the cliches still exist. I mean, the cliches were put into the heads by the politicians. And it is much easier to do then, for example, to try to unite all the regions by not, by the idea not related either to language or to the region or to the industry or agriculture, but by the ideas of purely political origin. So, I mean, in Europe you have battle of ideas, so I mean, you have fight between liberals and conservatives, etc. In Ukraine we don't have, I mean, we have 350 political parties registered in the Ministry of Justice. There is no political party which can be called conservative or liberal or really socialist or something else. So, I mean, from my point of view, I mean, they all should be shut down and re-registered and with a much, on much sort of more strict conditions. Because unless people understand that actually you are voting for the ideas and not for the promises and faces, the situation will repeat itself. So, I mean, one politician will create image of enemies of the politicians who are against him, but I mean, they will be not representing the political ideas. They will be representing financial clans, regional elite, or something else.
Could humor destroy this game?
Humor can influence this, and actually I think TV humor could destroy it, but somehow this topic is not interesting for the comedians in Ukraine. Because as I remember, actually there were no comedy shows based about cliches political cliches and the social cliches which exist in Ukraine. I don't know why.
Good afternoon. Hope and despair. What is the balance of hope and despair in Ukraine at the moment? I mean, Ukraine has been through a lot since 1989 and has seen a lot of high points and some low points. Where is it on the balance between hope and despair, and what would have to happen for things to get better or worse?
Well, I mean, hope always wins. So, I mean, hope gets more votes during the elections, which doesn't mean that actually the hope will be realized and will be turned into reality. But generally, I think in spite of the traditional despair in Ukrainian history, I mean, people are always hopeful. And I don't know what they're hoping now, but I mean, maybe maybe it will be enough to freeze the conflict, the war, to become more hopeful and more happy. But generally, I mean, if I think about Ukraine, I cannot give you an example of despair that I encountered somewhere or heard. I mean, it's always hopes. So I think the nation is also pathologically optimistic, which gives force to survive.
I'm actually quite interested to hear you say that, and kind of surprised to hear you say that, because I wonder, you think that this outweighs a sense of despair over stagnation, over things not changing fast enough, over sort of returns to old patterns? You think that hope wins out?
Well, subconsciously, definitely. Subconsciously, definitely, because I mean, I travel a lot in Ukraine. I know the countryside life. I have a house in the countryside. I mean, in my village, which is 100 kilometers away from Kyiv, in 2010, 70% of voters voted for Yanukovych. And this year, 80% of voters voted for Zelensky. So, I mean, they attach their hopes and their optimism to the faces again, not to the ideas or to the images. So I don't remember anybody actually crying on the street because of the political reasons in Ukraine.
So then we'll wait to see who comes after Zelensky when the next face of hope in Ukraine, right?
Yeah, but I mean, you should remember that actually Ukrainian mentality is based on the historical metrics of anarchy. I mean, everyone knows what is the best thing for Ukraine and disagrees with everybody else. That's why 350 political parties. But at the same time, I mean, it creates a special tolerance that actually everybody agrees with everybody else having different ideas. But then suddenly they are united, and either by Orange Revolution or Maidan or by Zelensky. I think actually, yeah, part of these collectivization moments are results of manipulations, maybe of TV manipulations, but some of them are sincere. So I mean, people want changes, and they are very impatient when they want changes. So at the moment, I mean, they are happy just to wait for the changes. But if the changes don't come in the nearest, I don't know, a year maybe, they will be impatient again.
Well, I know that some people in here are probably impatient to go see the poll results from today, so we will wrap up and let you go. And thank you very much for coming today, and thank you, Andrei, for
Thank you very much.
Us.
Okay.